In November 2007, Italian police found a single typewritten page in the briefcase of an arrested Cosa Nostra boss. It opened with an oath: "I swear to be faithful to Cosa Nostra. Should I betray, my flesh will burn." What followed was a list of 10 rules. Former members of the American families confirmed immediately that every one of those rules applied identically to La Cosa Nostra in the United States. They had simply never been written down. These are those 10 rules, what they meant inside the American Mafia, how they were enforced, and what happened to the men who broke them. Rule 1. No one can present himself directly to another member. There must be a third person. The first rule of the American Mafia is also its most fundamental security mechanism. Two made members of the same organization who have never been formally introduced cannot acknowledge that status to each other directly. A third made member who knows both men and has been formally introduced to each must perform the introduction. Without that introduction, neither man can confirm to the other that he is a member. The specific words and handshake used in that introduction, which varied by family and era but followed a consistent formal structure, were the only recognized method by which membership could be established between strangers. The reason for the rule is purely operational. If a law enforcement agent or informant approaches a made member claiming to be a fellow member, the rule creates an immediate verification problem. The target cannot confirm membership without a vouching third party. Without that voucher, no sensitive information is shared and no operational trust is extended. Every member is traceable back through a chain of witnessed, verified introductions. Michael Franzese, a former captain in the Colombo crime family, described the rule in precise terms. A made member of the Colombo family meeting, a made member of the Gambino family for the first time, required third person, someone formally introduced to both, to put them on record with each other. Without that ceremony, neither acknowledged the other's membership, regardless of how well known they both were in the streets. The rule was not social etiquette, it was a security protocol. The most dramatic test of this rule came from inside the FBI. Agent Joseph Pistone, operating undercover as Donnie Brasco, penetrated the Bonanno family for 6 years, between 1975 and 1981. His cover held for so long precisely because he navigated the vouching system correctly at every step, being introduced by existing members to progressively more senior figures. When his cover was finally blown in 1981, he had advanced far enough that formal proposals had been made to initiate him as a made member. The FBI subsequently estimated that Pistone's operation led to over 200 indictments and more than 100 convictions. The rule that was supposed to prevent exactly that kind of infiltration had been exploited from within, because someone in the chain had vouched for the wrong man. Rule 2. Never look at the wives of friends. The second rule prohibits any sexual or romantic involvement with the wife, girlfriend, daughter, sister, or mother of another made member. The rule extends to any woman understood to be in a protected relationship with someone inside the organization. The reasoning is practical before it is moral. The American Mafia's operational cohesion depends on a specific kind of trust between its members. Trust that cannot survive the introduction of sexual jealousy, divided loyalty, or the kind of personal vendetta that romantic violations almost inevitably produce. A man who has been wronged in this way cannot be counted on to follow orders, keep secrets, or prioritize the organization's interests over his personal grievance. The rule does not exist because the organization held conservative moral views. It exists because this specific category of violation is structurally incompatible with the discipline the organization requires. The consequences for breaking it were documented and severe. Tommy DeSimone, the Lucchese associate immortalized by Joe Pesci in Goodfellas, had his fate sealed in part by a pattern of behavior that included violations of this rule within his social circle. More directly, the 1970 murder of William "Billy Bats" Bent Vina, which DeSimone carried out without authorization, was connected to a broader pattern of conduct that had made him a problem the organization could not tolerate. Men who consistently disrespected the boundaries around other members' families became liabilities, and liabilities in the American Mafia had a standard resolution. Sammy Gravano described the rule in his own testimony and public accounts as one of the most strictly enforced within the Gambino family under both Paul Castellano and John Gotti. Men who violated it were dealt with quickly, sometimes by the aggrieved member directly, sometimes by the family's administration acting on a complaint. The rule was not always kept, but its violation was never treated as a minor matter. Rule 3. Never be seen with cops. The The third rule is the visible expression of omerta. No member of the organization is permitted to associate with law enforcement in any visible way, not to be seen in their company, not to accept favors from them, not to engage in any communication that could be interpreted as a relationship with the authorities. The rule operates on two levels simultaneously. At the operational level, it is pure security. A member seen regularly with police officers creates immediate suspicion about what information is flowing between them and in which direction. Even if no information is being passed, the appearance of a relationship is sufficient to destroy trust. In an organization that runs entirely on personal trust, the appearance of a breach functions identically to an actual breach. The damage is the same. At a deeper level, the rule is a statement of institutional identity. The American Mafia does not recognize law enforcement as a legitimate authority over its members. Internal disputes are resolved internally. Crimes committed against a member by another member are handled through the organization's own mechanisms. Going to the police, even as a victim, even when entirely innocent, is understood as an act of submission to an authority the organization categorically refuses to recognize. The most documented and dramatic example of this rule in American Mafia history involves Frank Costello. On May 2nd, 1957, Costello was shot in the lobby of his Central Park West apartment building in Manhattan. The bullet grazed his skull, and he survived. The building's doorman identified the shooter. The NYPD assigned 66 detectives to the case. Vincent Gigante was arrested and charged with attempted murder. At trial, prosecutors put Costello on the stand and asked him directly to identify his attacker. Costello told the court he had never gotten a look at the man and had not heard the shot. Gigante was acquitted. Costello was subsequently jailed for 15 days for contempt of court for refusing to answer questions about the attempt on his own life. He accepted the jail time without protest. He said nothing. Gigante went on to run the Genovese family for more than 2 decades. Rule 4. Don't go to pubs and clubs. The fourth rule specifically prohibited members from frequenting nightclubs, bars, and public social venues, places where visibility was high, where behavior could become unpredictable, and where a single careless conversation could unravel years of operational discipline. The rule reflects the foundational preference for invisibility that was supposed to govern organized crime. The organization's power rested on discretion. A member who made himself a visible fixture in the social nightlife of New York was advertising his existence, his associations, and his financial situation in ways that served no organizational purpose and created significant risks. Law enforcement surveillance is far easier to conduct in environments where targets appear regularly and predictably. Social venues are exactly those environments. This is the commandment that was most visibly and consistently ignored by the American families. Franzese acknowledged it directly. He was out 6 nights a week during his active years in the Colombo family, in clubs and restaurants where his presence was entirely public. John Gotti built a significant part of his personal legend on his visibility in the Ozone Park neighborhood where he held court, and later in the social clubs of Little Italy, where the FBI planted the recording devices that destroyed him. The Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, Gotti's Manhattan headquarters, was so well known to law enforcement that agents eventually managed to plant a bug in the apartment. Directly above it, recording over 600 hours of conversation that formed the backbone of his 1992 prosecution. The rule was not an American invention, but its consistent violation by the American families produced the most predictable pattern in the history of organized crime enforcement. The FBI found the social club, planted the bug, and waited. It worked with Gotti in 1989. It worked with the Colombo family before him. It worked across every major prosecution of the era. The men who ignored the fourth commandment gave their enemies a fixed address. Rule 5. Always be available for Cosa Nostra, even if your wife is about to give birth. The fifth rule is the most absolute statement of what membership in the American Mafia actually means. The organization comes before everything else in a member's life, before family, before personal obligation, before medical emergency, before anything. There are no acceptable excuses for failing to respond to a summons from a superior. Franzese described the moment this was communicated to him directly, on the night he was formally initiated into the Colombo family in the late 1970s. The acting boss told him without qualification that from that moment forward, Cosa Nostra was the first obligation of his life. Not his wife, not his children, not his parents. If called, he came. That was the oath he had taken and what he had agreed to. The practical significance of this rule extends well beyond ceremony. An organization that coordinates criminal operations across multiple crews, sometimes involving dozens of individuals who need to move simultaneously and respond to rapidly changing circumstances, cannot function if its members treat availability as optional. The rule creates a baseline of operational reliability that the organization depends on. It is also, in its own terms, a test of the depth of a member's commitment. The man who cannot be reached when needed is the man who, when it matters most, is somewhere else. The companion rule about punctuality was enforced with the same seriousness. Franzese described arriving late to a meeting at the Colombo family's Carroll Street headquarters in Brooklyn due to traffic. The dressing down he received was severe. The following day, he was told to return at noon. He arrived at 11:30 and waited outside until 4 in the afternoon, at which point his captain appeared, confirmed that the message had been received, and left without further discussion. In this life, there is no such thing as unavoidable lateness. You leave early enough to be on time under any conditions. Failure to do so is a choice, and choices in this organization have consequences that are communicated clearly and remembered permanently. Rule 6. Appointments must be respected. The sixth rule addresses the specific obligation of reliability in scheduled meetings. An appointment within the American Mafia is not a social arrangement. It is an operational commitment with security implications that go well beyond inconvenience. In an organization that survives partly through compartmentalization, where knowledge of who is meeting whom, when, and where is strictly controlled, a missed appointment creates immediate uncertainty. Has the person been arrested? Is he cooperating? Has he been compromised? Has something gone wrong that requires an immediate response? Every missed meeting generates a question that must be investigated before operations can continue. The rule eliminating missed appointments also eliminates that category of uncertainty and the security disruption it creates. Joseph Valachi, the Genovese family soldier whose October 1963 testimony before the Senate McClellan Committee became the first public account of the American Mafia's internal rules and structure by a made member, described this aspect of organizational discipline in detail. Valachi had been a member of the organization for more than 30 years. His testimony, broadcast nationally on television, watched by millions, and described by Attorney General Robert Kennedy as the biggest single intelligence breakthrough yet in combating organized crime, described a hierarchy in which responsiveness to summons and reliability in appointments were foundational expectations, not optional courtesies. His testimony before the Senate was the moment the American public first understood, from a primary source, that La Cosa Nostra was a real organization with real rules, real structure, and real enforcement mechanisms. The 11 days of hearings that followed produced the political momentum that eventually led to the RICO Act of 1970, the law that would ultimately be used to prosecute the commission itself in 1986. Rule 7. Wives must be treated with respect. The seventh rule addresses the treatment of a member's own wife and family within the household. It is the domestic companion to the second rule's prohibition on coveting the wives of others. In the home, a member's wife was to be treated with respect, kept separate from the operational side of the life, and shielded from the criminal reality her husband inhabited. Franzese drew a careful and honest distinction between the rule as formally stated and the reality of how it was sometimes observed. The formal requirement was clear. Wives were respected, not brought into criminal business, and protected from the most direct consequences of their husband's activities. The practical reality was that infidelity was common and tacitly accepted, provided it remained discreet and did not touch another member's family, which brought it back within the scope of the second commandment. The organizational logic behind this rule is security, not sentiment. A wife kept ignorant of her husband's criminal activities is a wife who cannot testify to what she does not know. She is also less likely to become a leverage point for law enforcement, a person prosecutors can threaten or offer deals to in exchange for information about her husband's operations. The Mafia's treatment of wives as formally separate from the life was simultaneously a domestic obligation and a deliberate security architecture. Across multiple major prosecutions of New York families in the 1980s and 1990s, the relative insulation of members' wives from direct criminal knowledge was noted by prosecutors as a consistent feature of the organizational culture. Rule 8. When asked for information, the answer must be the truth. The eighth rule imposed an obligation of honesty in internal communications. When a superior asked a question, the answer had to be truthful. Lying to a boss or a capo, if discovered, carried consequences severe enough that the rule functioned as a genuine deterrent across most of the organization's operational life. The mafia's leadership makes decisions based on reports provided by subordinates about the status of operations, the reliability of associates, the financial state of rackets, the loyalty of members. If those reports are unreliable, the decisions based on them are wrong. In a criminal organization, wrong decisions do not produce disappointing quarterly results. They produce arrests, failed operations, and dead men. A boss who authorized an action based on false information provided by a subordinate and whose people subsequently paid for that decision was not dealing with an administrative error. He had been betrayed, and betrayal in the American Mafia carried a standard response. Franzese acknowledged that the rule was violated in practice with considerable regularity. Men lied to protect themselves, to cover for associates, to conceal financial irregularities, and to manage the perceptions of superiors they feared. What the rule accomplished was not a guarantee of internal honesty, but a system in which deception was understood as a serious violation, rather than an accepted feature of internal communication. The cost of getting caught in a lie was high enough that lies, when told, needed to be carefully constructed, and the exposure created by any single discovered lie was sufficient to put a man's entire position within the organization at risk. Under John Gotti's administration of the Gambino family, this rule was enforced with particular harshness. Men who were caught in misrepresentations to Gotti personally faced immediate and severe consequences, a pattern documented in the FBI recordings from the Ravenite that captured Gotti discussing specific cases of dishonesty within his own circle. Rule 9. Money cannot be appropriated if it belongs to others or to other families. The ninth rule is the property code of the American Mafia's internal governance. It prohibits stealing from fellow members, cheating on financial counts, diverting money meant for a superior, and infringing on the territory or revenue streams of another family without permission. The rule exists because the American Mafia is fundamentally an economic organization. Its primary function is to generate revenue through criminal activity and distribute that revenue through a defined hierarchy, a percentage of every soldier's earnings moving up to his capo, a percentage of the capo's earnings moving up to the administration. Any money diverted from that flow is not a personal transgression. It is an attack on the organizational structure that makes everything else possible. The territorial dimension of the rule carries equal weight. The commission, established by Lucky Luciano in 1931, assigned specific geographic territories and revenue streams to each of the 5 families. Operating in another family's territory without authorization, soliciting another family's clients, or moving into a racket controlled by a different organization were violations that the commission itself was designed to adjudicate and enforce. When those boundaries were ignored without resolution through the commission's processes, the consequences were direct. Carmine Galante's decision in the late 1970s to seize drug territory from the Gambino family without authorization and to refuse to share the resulting revenue with any other family was the documented reason the commission authorized his execution in 1979. He was shot dead on the patio of a Brooklyn restaurant on July 12, 1979, his cigar still clenched in his teeth. 3 families had approved the order. His own bodyguards had sold him out to the killers. The 9th commandment had consequences, and Galante had ignored every one of them. Rule 10. Who cannot be part of Cosa Nostra? The 10th rule is not a single prohibition but a gatekeeping list. Categories of individuals who, regardless of their personal qualities or criminal record, could not be admitted to full membership in the American Mafia. The first exclusion covers anyone with a close relative in law enforcement, a father, brother, or son who is a police officer, judge, prosecutor, or other representative of the state. The logic is structural. A member with a family member in law enforcement is a permanent vulnerability. The FBI might approach that relative. The relative might already have been approached. The member might feel divided in ways that the organization cannot predict or control. In Sicily, the rule was absolute. In the American families, the application was somewhat more flexible. Men with relatives in law enforcement were not automatically excluded, but they were expected to demonstrate clearly that those relationships posed no operational risk. Any ambiguity on that point was resolved in favor of exclusion. The second exclusion covers anyone with a family member who has previously cooperated with law enforcement or betrayed the organization. A man whose brother or father had broken under pressure was regarded as a higher statistical risk than one without that family history. The organization was not making a moral judgment about inherited character. It was making an operational calculation about the probability of future conduct based on the documented conduct of close relatives. The third exclusion, anyone who behaves badly and doesn't hold to moral values, is the most ambiguous element of the 10th commandment. Within the context of the American families, the practical meaning was closer to organizational reliability and personal discipline than to conventional morality. A man who was erratic, who could not be trusted under pressure, who had demonstrated poor judgment in ways that created exposure for people around him. These were the qualities the rule was designed to screen out. The initiation ceremony, in which a new member formally swore his oath and committed himself to the organization's rules, was the final checkpoint in that screening process. The 10th commandment established the criteria that determined who was eligible to reach it. 10 rules, written in Italian, found in a briefcase outside Palermo, confirmed by every former American member who was asked about them. They governed the organization's internal life for decades before anyone outside it had ever seen them written down. Some were kept with remarkable consistency, the omerta principle that Frank Costello honored from a hospital bed, refusing to name the man who had shot him in his own building. Some were adapted almost immediately upon arrival in the United States. The prohibition on nightclubs, ignored by virtually every family from the day it was supposed to apply. What all 10 shared was a single purpose: to keep the organization alive in an environment that wanted it destroyed. Most of the time, they worked. When they failed, the consequences were on the public record, in federal indictments, in trial transcripts, and in the statements of the men who eventually decided that the oath they had taken was not worth what it cost them.